Imagine making uncertainty your personal superpower. What would that do for your life? I'm your host, George Nagle, and our guest today is certain he can show you how to do that. Let's get started. Harvard University, Harvard Business School, University of Southern California, Singapore Management University, the University College of London, MIT, Brown, and Boston University all have had the distinction of Dr. Vaughn Tan providing lectures for them. During his time as a student and presenter at these and other institutions, he has investigated individual and organizational responses to uncertainty and ambiguity in various contexts. He is particularly interested in how open ended structures and processes enable adaptation and innovation in uncertain situations. Just to be clear, his academic success is also backed up with accomplishment outside of the classroom. He has worked on several projects such as Google Maps, Google Earth, and Google Ads. He has been, and in many circumstances still is, an advisor to 8 organizations spanning from forest conservation to food innovation. All of that in addition to being well publicized. He is the author of The Uncertainty Mindset, Innovation Insights from the Frontiers of Food. He is also the winner of 6 different honors and the recipient of 3 different grants. Welcome, Vaughn, to the Creative Ideation Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
How do you distinguish between uncertainty and change when you're talking about mindsets?
A mindset really is just how you think about the world and what assumptions you're making about the world that you're thinking about, right? So you can have the famous one is the growth mindset. This is Carol Dweck, the first of the mindsets that people really got excited about. The idea that either you've got a fixed way of thinking about the world is fixed, we can't really do anything about it, or that the world is something that allows us to grow, we can change it. That's the growth mindset. That just changes the way you think about what the world is and also changes the way you act in the world once you're inside it. In terms of uncertainty versus change, I think change is something that we see happening as people. Like just I'm talking about you and me and really everybody else. We see change happening to us all the time. We see the world around us changing. It's really how we interpret what that change means that comes down to this distinction between risk and uncertainty in terms of mindset. If you make the assumption that the change that you're seeing is something that is understandable in advance, that the change is going to happen in a way that you already know what is going to change, you don't have really an uncertainty mindset necessarily, right? Because the uncertainty mindset really says, we see that things are changing or they are going to change, and we believe that to some extent we don't know how it is going to change and we don't know what's going to result. When we have that belief that the change is in some way not known or not knowable to us, we behave in different ways, right? We don't assume we know what's going to happen. What we do instead is we think, how can I figure out what is happening as it happens? How do I do small things that help me learn, that don't commit me too much, so that I'm not overcommitted to a particular way of thinking about what the change could be and get left behind if the change turns out to be different? So uncertainty and change are not different from each other. It's just how we think about what the change will be that has an effect on what mindset we have. So you can either have a risk mindset where you assume you know what's going to happen, even if you don't know exactly what's going to happen, or you can have an uncertainty mindset where you make assumptions about change that aren't about expecting to know what that change will be. They're instead about figuring it out along the way.
Do you think that allows for a healthy amount of uncertainty? And should we actually try to have some uncertainty in our actual lives?
Absolutely, yes. And the reason I say this is you cannot have anything new unless there was a time when you don't know what is going to happen next, right? Like the moment you know everything, the moment there's no uncertainty, you've automatically gotten rid of the possibility for surprise, you've gotten rid of the opportunity for delight, for innovation, for novelty. All of those things can only happen when in some way you weren't expecting what was going to happen, right? And so if we want to have novelty, if we want to have surprise, if we want to have delight that is surprising, we need to have a world in which, to some extent, we don't know what's going to happen next, because that's the only thing that provides room for something new to happen.
Do you think that there are some patterns that people should look out for within their own thinking to recognize if they're experiencing uncertainty at a healthy level, or I'm going to kind of paraphrase what you just said, they're just kind of lost and they have zero anything of direction or fortitude to be able to move forward and accomplish.
It's not always the case that in every situation uncertainty is good. There are going to be some things, some kinds of situations, and I'll give you a few examples in a moment, where just having uncertainty is not a good thing, right? So, for instance, if there is a very well understood way of producing a widget, let's say like manufacturing a glass, uh, it's well understood. The process is very clearly codified. Actually, you're talking about pathogens in food safety management. That's another one of those situations where we understand how to produce safe food that's bacteriologically and microbiologically safe. I'm not saying inject uncertainty into that situation. What I'm saying is understand the situation that we're facing to figure out whether or not the things that need to be done are understood or not understood. And if they're not understood, figure out whether or not they should be known or shouldn't be known, right? So, for instance, let's distinguish between two kinds of situations. One situation is you're a production line and you're manufacturing some food and you want it to be microbiologically safe for distribution and consumption. The other situation is you're trying to manufacture a new kind of food, like you're trying to do some food innovation. In the former situation, I really don't think there should be very much uncertainty about how you process the food. You should know how you're processing the food, and there should be a way of accounting for whether or not you're meeting those KPIs in terms of how much biological activity is still in the packaged food product once it's left your production line. Now, in the latter situation, if you're trying to make a brand new kind of food, it's not appropriate, right, to say we need to know exactly what the result will be before we start. Like, it's a totally different category of activity. And so I think the first question to ask when you're trying to answer the question that you posed, like how do you know when you've got too much uncertainty or when you've got the wrong kind of uncertainty? You should have to look at the situation you're facing. If you're trying to do something which is already well understood, where it is possible to know what it is that you're trying to do, then you shouldn't be seeking uncertainty there, right? If, on the other hand, you're trying to do something which is new, if you're trying to make a new product, or you're trying to create a product that is delightful because it's surprising, like you're trying to produce a new music album, or write a new book, or make a new film, or produce a new piece of art, uh, you should absolutely be trying to seek out uncertainty.
If you're looking at this uncertainty and how it generates different aspects, positive or negative, what are some elements that you would call out about that generative process around uncertainty that people should be aware of?
I think the first thing is something which I've already mentioned, which is this idea of having clear guardrails, right? Like this idea that uh, when you're trying to explore a space, uncertainty is really about exploring a space where you don't really know what's inside the space yet, and you don't really know what you're going to get as a result of your exploration. The key thing about designing for generative uncertainty is to have very clear guardrails, like inside the space, a bunch of exploration, because we know this is a space where we might want the result. But outside of this space, we've already identified these areas where we definitely don't want to go. Don't go there. What this does is it reduces wasted effort as long as you continue to protect the freedom to explore stuff inside the guardrails. And the freedom to explore stuff means the freedom to try things that may not work, which is the uncertainty that we're talking about in this context. Um, the second thing is if you want to have generative uncertainty, you have to encourage emergence, right? Which means you have to encourage trying things that are really new inside those guardrails. And for organizations, what this means is saying upfront that this will be a messy and probably failure prone process. It's going to be a process where things are not going to work straight off the bat. And so reconstructing the way you do the work so that you're not just encouraging people to do big one-off high stakes projects, but instead encouraging them to reconstruct those projects to be as small, as cheap, and as fast to run as possible is a big part of generating this kind of uncertainty that I'm talking about. And then the third part is being ready to support by scaling the things that seem to work, right? So the second part of running lots of small, potentially failure-prone experiments that are cheap and easy to run is that you're going to see lots of potential pathways to making something which is new, which is what we want. And those initial small, cheap experiments, they probably need to be scaled up to like slightly bigger experiments to see whether or not this initial promise of success is actually likely to work or not. And I think a lot of the ways that organizations tend to resource ideas and experiments also relies on big success before they get big funding or big resourcing. And the alternative to that, which helps create generative uncertainty, is to say, don't do big things first, do lots of small things. That also makes it easier to fail in them. And when you do lots of small things, report the results as soon as you can. Because if the result is potentially good, then we can also give a bit more funding so that you can go to the next step of a project experiment that builds on that initial potential success to try it out and try and validate that it might be bigger. So a lot of these things, I think they are sensible in the context of prototyping or rapid prototyping. What I'm trying to say here is that these are also ways that you can use uncertainty in a way that helps you get where you want to go, right? And that uncertainty is in giving people the space to explore a set of approaches or a problem space where you know that if you explore it, there's likely to be something that is successful and useful that comes out of it. But to give them the opportunity by constructing the framework in which they do the exploration so that they don't have to do big experiments, they can do small ones and they can potentially do many of them. And then encouraging them by, again, putting in place structures, we can talk about that, where they report the results of these experiments frequently so that you can see when there are possibilities for success from these experiments, and you can fund those in whatever way they need to be carried on as bigger experiments.
That's a fantastic point on one, the rapid prototyping, but the frequent report outs. And I would add to that, I encourage, my clients when they do the report outs that they report out to the customer first and get the approval or the turn down before they ever bring it into upper management for approval. Because if you have 12 to 16 customers saying, yes, this is what we value, this is what we'll pay for it, when can we have it, within just a couple of prototypes, that tends to release funding pretty quick.
Absolutely, yes. No, I'm really glad you brought that up because the not only should you be getting feedback directly from the people for whom you ostensibly are developing this new product, I think also that there is one problem with feedback and sort of reporting out structures that most people set up, right? Which is that it's always this idea that your feedback is very high stakes. You only give feedback or you only ask for feedback when you are pretty sure things have already succeeded, which means you've already invested a lot of time, effort, and energy into doing something before you get any feedback on it at all, or before you give any indication of whether or not it's succeeding to people who might be supporting you, whether they're a customer with approval of this line of thinking, or if it's senior management with actual resources like people and money and time. Instead, I think what I'm encouraging is making the giving and the receiving of feedback something which is thought of as a casual thing that happens all the time, right? So that you don't have to wait for a quarter or 2 quarters and produce an 80 slide deck that is very consequential in order to get feedback on a small experiment. The idea is really to do things that are so small and so trivial that it's easy and fast to run them as experiments, and then to think about the feedback cycle as also being small and trivial so that you can do it literally all the time, like as part of daily life. I think maybe explaining it this way doesn't adequately capture how fundamentally different it is, what I'm proposing, from the way I see iterative prototyping happening in organizations, right? Like iterative prototyping, we talk about it as rapid prototyping, and it makes it seem like it's actually rapid, but you're not talking about experiments that happen intraday. You're not talking about giving feedback that happens like walking to the water cooler and telling someone, hey, I just did this thing. Do you want to see the result and tell me what you think about it? It's that level of quotidian, everyday, small experiments with small feedback that I'm talking about. Because that's the kind of thing that will really unlock what I think of as generative uncertainty, right? Like letting people be uncertain at a level which is small enough that it doesn't feel risky, it doesn't feel challenging, it doesn't feel intimidating, it just feels normal. And the moment you start to do that, then the whole organization becomes more and more capable of being in a place where they don't know what's going to happen next because they're used to doing things that are small scale and certain, that they can become better at dealing with larger and larger scales of uncertainty.
Do you think that a fair analogy to that and that very rapid feedback that's coming in towards, we'll call it failure, but not necessarily a failure, because we don't view failure the same way most people do, right? Within my groups and what I tell clients is a fail is a first attempt in learning, which is the most natural way to actually make progression. And I think that is what you're saying. Would you liken it as an analogy for those that aren't necessarily involved in product development or solution development to how a baby learns how to walk, right? They are constantly trying little things and looking for that constant feedback loop.
Yes, I absolutely would make that same analogy because I think that there's actually a few things about how people learn, whether they're students in schools or babies learning how to be humans, that are very relevant for this. One of them is you cannot learn unless you don't know. I mean, it's very simple. Like if you already know, there's no point in learning. And in fact, it's not possible to learn something that you already know because you've already learned it, right? So the first very important point to make is learning is only possible when there is acknowledgement that you don't know something and that you are then ready to learn something. The second point to make, which I think you brought up with the metaphor of the baby or the analogy of the baby, is that uh, babies and humans learn by trying things out and seeing whether or not those things work, right? So the best way of doing that is to try small things where the downside of failing is not existential crisis. Because what that does is it gradually builds you up so that you are able to deal with the downside of an experiment that is designed to teach you something that doesn't work. So if you think about the baby, uh, babies tend to, just because of the way babies and other juvenile entities work, their capacity to do things tends to grow slowly. So the first couple of days a baby is alive outside of the womb, it can't really do anything other than like lie there and like process information. It can't like go, climb up onto a stove and potentially put its hand on a hot pot or anything like that, right? So I think there is something really important to extract from that as a learning, which is when you are starting out in learning anything, you have to understand that the actions that you take need to be small and relatively low downside to you because you are still learning how to learn, right? And this is actually something that we see also in students when they're learning how to learn other things that are like, subject matter material, like if you are learning how to, for instance, think about strategy in a business school, right? You cannot really start people with really big changes in how they think about things without first exposing them to small changes that are less threatening, don't arouse the threat response. And as they build that capacity to do something which is different, they build more of a capacity to do more different things progressively. It's a bit, I guess another good analogy would be people who do weight training. If you've never lifted weights before, it would be kind of silly to immediately try and lift, I don't know, 200 pounds. But if you've been gradually ramping up your ability to lift some number of weights, at some point you might be able to get to 200 pounds, but you will have gotten there by lifting 10 and then 20 and then 50 and then 100 pounds along the way, right? So this idea of progressive loading so that you can gradually build capacity, I think is a really big thing. So in terms of how we learn how to be good at dealing with uncertainty, I think this is a logical place to talk about it because the main reason why we're not good as individuals or as organizations at dealing with the uncertainty that is necessary for doing anything new is because we really hate it, right? It's like a visceral, very instinctive reaction. We really don't like it as humans when we don't know what is going to happen next and we don't know how to do it. It's embarrassing. And I think back in evolutionary time, there was probably a very good existential reason why we avoided situations where we don't know what's going to happen next. Like we might die, like the metaphor that I love to give is way back in evolutionary time, If you're walking back home to your cave, and there is the option between the slightly longer route that you've scouted before in the daytime and you've walked at night, where you know that there are no places for big animals with sharp teeth to hide, versus the shorter route through the dark jungle, which you've not gone through before, where there are lots of places for animals with big sharp teeth to hide. There is a very, very good evolutionary reason why we choose the lower uncertainty path. But nowadays, the evolutionary sort of learned instinct, like our bodies behave in a certain way when we're faced with uncertainty, like we have a threat response. It's no longer appropriate for the kinds of uncertainty that we face because those kinds of uncertainty don't have to be existential, right? So most of the reason why I think we are not very good at dealing with uncertainty is because we're evolutionarily evolved to not be good at that. And there are ways to untrain that feeling, right? By gradually exposing ourselves to progressively more uncomfortable situations that are uncertain, but are uncertain and are designed in ways that help us learn how to deal with uncertainty and learn from it. uh, I think the metaphor of the baby or the analogy of the baby is of taking baby steps so that they can take bigger steps later. And I think the same thing needs to happen when we're learning how to deal with uncertainty that is generative and productive. Like we cannot learn how to do it big time until we've done small experiments along the way to learn how to deal with the discomfort that we naturally face when we're dealing with uncertainty.
So, Vaughn, tell our listeners and viewers the best ways to reach out to you if they wanted to get in contact.
All of them are listed on my website, vaughntan.org. And you'll find an email address where I'm very happy to take questions. You can also find me on the usual social media networks. They're all linked there. But if you want to follow on the writing, there's two places. I post new writing on the website. It's in the writings tab. But I also have a weekly newsletter. Actually, it's a bi-weekly newsletter where I do things that are a bit more topical and maybe a bit more sort of be for general audiences. And that's the uncertainty mindset.substack.com.
Excellent. Juan, I appreciate your time, your wisdom, and your insight. Fantastic information. Thank you so much.
For sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invite.